If your garden is looking bare and the calendar already says July, take a breath because I've got good news. You have not missed your window. I know it can feel that way. You had plans back in spring, and then the weather didn't cooperate, or your schedule got eaten alive, or life just kept showing up with other priorities. That's not failure, that's real life, and real life gardeners still get to have beautiful gardens. Here's what years of getting my hands in the dirt has taught me. Plants don't know what month it is. They respond to conditions: warmth, water, soil, light. And in July, those conditions are actually ideal for a whole category of perennials built by nature to handle exactly this kind of heat. I'm John Sam, and on this channel we talk practical gardening for people who want results without the overwhelm. If that sounds like your kind of place, subscribe, because we put out new content every week. Now let's get into it. 10 perennials you can plant this month in the heat of July and still get real color this season. Plant 1. Coneflower. I want to start here because Echinacea purpurea is one of the most forgiving and rewarding perennials in the American garden. It's native to North America, hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9, and native plants didn't survive thousands of years by being picky about when they got planted. Coneflowers bloom in purple, pink, white, and golden yellow depending on the variety, and they keep producing through the hottest weeks of summer instead of slowing down like so many other flowers do. There are dozens of cultivars worth knowing. Magnus gives you the classic purple-pink flower with a bold orange cone. White Swan brings a cooler, more formal look to a border. And if you want something a little more modern, look at the Sombrero and Cheyenne Spirit series, which were bred for compact growth and a wider color range, including reds and tangerines that the old-fashioned varieties never had. Plant it in full sun with well-drained soil. Water it consistently for the first 4 to 6 weeks while it settles in, and after that it becomes remarkably self-sufficient, often going weeks without supplemental water once its roots are established. Bees visit constantly. Butterflies land on those wide, flat flower heads all day. And if you leave the seed head standing into fall instead of deadheading everything, you'll have goldfinches feeding right in your yard through the cooler months. It's genuinely one of the few plants that gives you something in every season. For July planting specifically, look for an established transplant at the nursery rather than seed, one that's already several inches tall with a healthy root system filling out the pot. Seed started this late simply won't catch up. Give it a good soak the day you plant, keep up with watering for the first 2 weeks, and mulch 2 to 3 inches around the base to hold moisture in the heat and keep weeds down while the roots are still shallow. Space plants 18 to 24 inches apart to give them room to fill out over the next couple of seasons, and resist the urge to crowd them for instant impact. Coneflower rewards patience. One more thing worth knowing. Coneflower is deer and rabbit resistant, which makes it a smart pick if wildlife has been raiding your beds. It also tolerates poor, rocky, or clay soil better than most flowering perennials, so if you've got a difficult patch of ground you've been avoiding, this might be exactly the plant to start with. If you want to expand your patch down the road, coneflower is easy to propagate by division in early spring once clumps mature after 2 or 3 years. Or you can let it self-seed naturally by leaving a few heads standing, though named cultivars won't always come true from seed the way the straight species does. In terms of design, coneflower works best planted in drifts of 5 or more rather than as a single specimen. It reads as a scattered accent on its own, but as a real statement in a grouping, and it holds its own in both a formal border and a loose, naturalistic meadow-style planting. The most common mistake gardeners make with coneflower isn't neglect, it's actually kindness. Rich, heavily fertilized soil and frequent watering produce floppy, short-lived plants, while a leaner site with occasional deep watering produces the sturdy, long-lived clumps this plant is known for. If your coneflower foliage starts looking distorted or stunted with green streaking through the petals, that's a sign of aster yellows, a disease spread by leafhoppers, and the only real fix is removing and disposing of the affected plant before it spreads to its neighbors. It's also worth knowing that coneflower has a long history beyond the garden. Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains used echinacea for centuries before it became one of the most widely sold herbal supplements in modern health food stores. And that popularity is part of why breeders have spent so much effort in the last 20 years expanding the color range and bloom size well beyond the original wild purple form. From a bloom timing standpoint, expect flowers to start roughly 6 to 8 weeks after a July transplant goes in, which puts most gardeners right in that late August window. And because each flower stays fresh for 2 to 3 weeks on the plant, a single clump can look good continuously for well over a month without any real gaps. Plant 2, Black-Eyed Susan. The thing about Black-Eyed Susans is that they bloom precisely when everything else in the garden starts looking tired, late summer especially, when other flowers have peaked and faded. These golden blooms with their dark brown centers show up right on time, like they planned it. Rudbeckia hirta and Rudbeckia fulgida are both native to North America, both pollinator magnets, and both wonderfully unfussy about soil richness, thriving in zones 3 through 9 depending on the species. There's an important distinction worth knowing between the two common types. Rudbeckia hirta is technically a short-lived perennial or biennial in many climates, meaning it may only stick around 2 or 3 years, but it self-seeds so generously that most gardeners never notice the individual plants aging out. Rudbeckia fulgida, often sold as goldsturm, is the longer-lived, true perennial version, and it's the one to choose if you want a permanent clump rather than a self-renewing patch. Plant them in full sun, though they'll tolerate a little afternoon shade in well-drained soil. Because they bloom later in the season, a July planting actually makes strategic sense. You're putting them in right before their big moment. They use these first few weeks to establish roots, and just when you think you might not get much this year, they throw out those cheerful golden blooms anyway. Water deeply twice a week for the first month, then taper off as the roots take hold. They also hold up beautifully as cut flowers, with a long vase life that pairs well with almost anything else you're growing, zinnias, salvia, or even the coneflower you just planted next to them. Powdery mildew can show up on the lower leaves in humid, crowded conditions, so give plants at least 18 inches of spacing and water at the soil line rather than overhead. Deadhead spent blooms through summer to keep new flowers coming, and if you leave the last flush standing into fall, the seed heads feed finches right through winter, the same way coneflower does. Black-eyed Susans do best planted in groups of at least 3, since a single stem tends to look sparse while a cluster reads as a real drift of color, and they're particularly effective massed along a fence line or the back of a border where their height, typically 2 to 3 feet, can anchor shorter plants in front. They're one of the easiest perennials to grow from seed if you're planning ahead for next year, but since we're planting in July, stick with transplants for this round and save seed starting for spring. If your soil is on the poorer, sandier side, resist the urge to over-amend it. Black-eyed Susans actually perform better in lean conditions than in rich garden soil, which tends to produce excessive leafy growth at the expense of flowers. They're also one of the more reliably deer-resistant choices on this list, since deer generally avoid the slightly rough, hairy texture of the foliage, which makes this a dependable pick if you garden in an area with heavy browsing pressure. If you're building out a full pollinator bed this summer, Black-eyed Susan is a natural companion to plant number 1 on this list, coneflower, since the two share a nearly identical bloom window and their contrasting shapes. The daisy-form Susan against the domed coneflower cone create visual rhythm without you having to think too hard about design. Some gardeners also confuse Black-eyed Susan with its taller, later blooming cousin, Brown-eyed Susan or Rudbeckia triloba, which can reach 4 to 5 feet and blooms into October. So if you're shopping and want the classic 2-foot border plant described here, double-check the tag for the species name rather than relying on the common name alone. Plant 3. Yarrow. Yarrow looks like it should be fragile, with lacy feathery leaves and flat clusters of tiny flowers. But Achillea millefolium is one of the toughest perennials you can put in the ground, hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9 and practically made for hot, dry July conditions. If your garden gets baked by afternoon sun and dries out between waterings, Yarrow is your answer. It handles drought better than almost anything on this list, and it spreads gently over time through underground rhizomes, filling gaps without becoming aggressive the way some spreading perennials do. Blooms come in white, cream, yellow, soft pink, and deep red depending on the cultivar, so there's likely a shade that fits whatever else you're growing. Varieties like Moonshine give you silvery foliage wit. Lemon yellow flowers, while Cerise Queen leans into a much bolder pink red. It also dries exceptionally well. Cut the flowers when they're fully open, hang them upside down in a cool, dry place out of direct light, and you'll have arrangements that hold their color and shape for months, which makes it a favorite for gardeners who like to bring the outdoors in during winter. Plant Yarrow where the water drains well. It does not like sitting in wet soil, and root rot is by far the most common way gardeners lose this plant. If your soil tends toward clay, work in some coarse sand or compost before planting to improve structure. Space plants about 18 inches apart since they will fill in. Yarrow pairs beautifully with Coneflower, Black-eyed Susan, and Daylily, all plants we've already covered since they share the same sun and water needs, and this kind of grouping is exactly how experienced gardeners build a low-maintenance bed that looks intentional rather than scattered. It's also historically been used as an herb, and it's largely deer and rabbit resistant, another point in its favor if wildlife pressure is an issue where you garden. One thing to watch for with Yarrow is its tendency to flop or sprawl in overly rich or overly shaded conditions. If your stems are leaning instead of standing upright, the fix is almost always more sun and less fertilizer rather than staking. Established clumps benefit from division every 3 to 4 years, both to keep them vigorous and to prevent the center of the clump from thinning out and going bare, a common issue with older plantings. Yarrow also happens to be one of the best plants for a xeriscape or low-water garden design, since once it's established it can genuinely go through an entire dry spell without irrigation, which makes it a smart choice if you're trying to reduce your overall watering load this summer rather than add to it. Just be mindful in small gardens that some straight species Yarrow can spread more assertively than expected. If you want the color without the spread, look for clump-forming cultivars specifically bred to stay more contained. Plant 4. Shasta Daisy. Those bright white petals around a bold yellow center are what most people picture when they close their eyes and think summer garden, and for good reason. Leucanthemum superbum is hardy in USDA zones 4 through 9 and can tolerate winter temperatures down to 30 below zero once established. So cold isn't the concern here, heat management during establishment is. It thrives in full sun but manages fine in partial shade too, especially in the hottest parts of the country. For July planting, 2 things matter most. First, trim off any spent or weak flower heads at planting time. It feels counterintuitive, you might want to see blooms right away, but redirecting the plant's energy toward roots in those first few weeks pays off with a stronger, more vigorous bloomer later in the season and next year. Second, drainage matters a lot. Shastas do not like wet feet, so if your soil holds water, mix in compost or consider a raised bed, which also happens to make them easier to maintain long-term since the clumps benefit from division every 2 to 3 years. Once established, they're generous bloomers and excellent for cutting, with sturdy stems that hold up well in a vase, and the clumps fill out into impressive patches of white and gold year after year. They pair especially well with lavender and Russian sage, whose silvery foliage and purple tones make the white daisies pop, and with ornamental grasses for texture contrast. One practical note if you have pets: Shasta daisies contain mild toxins that can cause vomiting or skin irritation in dogs and cats. So if you've got a curious animal that likes to sample the garden, plant them somewhere less accessible or keep an eye on things while the clump is young. Shasta daisies are also deer-resistant, which makes them a reliable choice for the front or middle of a border in areas where wildlife pressure has ruled out other flowering perennials. Taller varieties, some reaching up to 3 feet, may benefit from staking or planting alongside sturdier neighbors like Daylily or Russian sage that can help support them in windy spots, while dwarf cultivars like snowcap stay compact and rarely need any support at all. As the clump matures over a few seasons, you'll notice the center thinning out while the outer edges stay vigorous. That's your cue to divide it, lifting the whole clump in early spring or fall and replanting the healthiest outer sections while discarding the tired center. Shasta Daisy is also a genuinely good choice if you're gardening for someone new to the hobby, since it forgives inconsistent watering better than Balm or Shasta's moisture-loving cousins, while still delivering that classic, crowd-pleasing summer look people immediately recognize. Plant 5. Balm. Balm earns its place in more ways than one. It blooms in vivid red. Pink, purple, and lavender, spiky, unusual flowers unlike anything else in the garden, and the foliage carries a pleasant minty fragrance when you brush against it, which is no accident. Balm is in the mint family. It attracts bees, obviously, but also hummingbirds, which will find a newly planted patch within days. Monarda blooms mid to late summer, which makes a July planting well-timed. You have a real shot at seeing flowers this season if you get transplants in soon. Skip seeds this late in the year. Go for an established plant instead, since seedlings started now won't reach blooming size before fall. Balm prefers rich, moist soil and doesn't like to dry out the way Yarrow or Lavender do, so water consistently, roughly once or twice a week depending on your climate, and mulch around the base to retain moisture and keep roots cooler through the hottest part of summer. Watch for powdery mildew in humid conditions. It's the plant's one real vulnerability. Good air circulation, meaning don't crowd it against a fence or wall, and watering at the base rather than overhead both help a great deal. Newer mildew-resistant varieties like Jacob Klein and the Panorama series are worth asking your nursery about if mildew has been a problem for you in the past. Balm spreads by rhizomes and can become a bit enthusiastic in rich soil, so plan on dividing clumps every 3 or 4 years to keep it in bounds and to share extras with neighbors. It's a genuinely striking plant in a border, and because hummingbirds favor tubular red and pink flowers specifically, this is one of your best options on this whole list if attracting them is a priority. Balm also has a long history as a culinary and medicinal herb. Its leaves can be steeped for tea, and it's actually the plant that historically gave us the flavor profile associated with Earl Grey-style bergamot blends, even though it's unrelated botanically to the citrus bergamot the tea is named for. In the garden, it works beautifully massed at the back of a bed where hummingbirds have a clear flight path in, and it pairs naturally with Daylily and black-eyed Susan for a layered, cottage-style look. If you're gardening in a smaller space, look for compact varieties bred specifically to stay under 2 feet, since standard Balm can reach 3 to 4 feet, and spread aggressively enough to need a root barrier in tight beds. And if a hard summer leaves your plant looking ragged with mildew by late August, don't panic. Cut it back hard to a few inches above the ground, and it will typically flush out fresh, clean foliage before frost. Plant 6. Salvia. Few perennials attract pollinators as efficiently as Salvia. Those tall spikes of blue and purple flowers pull in bees and butterflies from the moment they open and keep blooming through summer into fall with the right care. Salvia nemorosa, one of the most garden-friendly species, is hardy in zones 4 through 10 and prefers full sun and lean, well-drained soil. Too much fertilizer just makes it leggy and floppy instead of the compact, upright habit you actually want. For July planting, here's a tip that makes a real difference. Choose a plant with buds rather than fully open blooms at the nursery. A plant already covered in open flowers has spent a lot of its initial energy, while a plant still in bud has weeks of blooming ahead of it, so you'll get significantly more flowers out of it over the following month. Plant deeply, water thoroughly at planting, and give young transplants a little temporary shade during the worst afternoon heat for the first week or two. A piece of shade cloth or even a strategically placed chair works fine. Once established, Salvia is remarkably heat and drought tolerant, needing only occasional deep watering. Cutting it back by about a third after the first flush of blooms fades often triggers a strong second wave of flowers later in summer, so don't be shy with the pruning shears. This is one of the few plants that actually rewards aggressive cutting. Popular varieties include May Night, with deep violet-blue spikes, and Caradonna, which has nearly black stems that make the purple flowers pop even more. Salvia also works well in containers if you're short on bed space, and it's generally left alone by deer and rabbits, which makes it a reliable anchor plant for a pollinator garden, even in areas with heavy browsing pressure. Salvia is one of the most efficient plants on this list in terms of effort versus reward. A single, well-placed clump can bloom for months with almost no intervention beyond that mid-season haircut, and it tends to look tidy and structured even when the rest of the border is a bit unruly, which makes it a favorite among gardeners who want impact without a lot of upkeep. It combines especially well with plants that have rounder or flatter flower forms, like Coneflower, Black-Eyed Susan, or Yarrow, since the vertical spikes create contrast against those BR. Odor blooms and give a bed a sense of layered structure rather than everything sitting at the same height. Established clumps can be divided every 3 to 4 years in spring if you want to expand your planting, or if the center starts to die out, a common pattern with Salvia after 4 or 5 seasons in the same spot. If you notice minimal flowering despite healthy-looking foliage, the usual culprit is too much shade. Salvia genuinely needs a full 6 hours of direct sun to perform at its best. Plant 7. Daylily. Daylilies have a reputation for being nearly indestructible, and it's earned. Hemerocallis is hardy in zones 3 through 9, grows in almost every soil type, handles drought and heat, and comes back year after year with very little intervention, which makes it one of the best bets on this whole list for a July planting. Each individual bloom lasts only a day, hence the name, but each stem, called a scape, carries multiple buds that open in sequence, so the overall display continues for weeks even though any single flower is short-lived. Plant in July and you may catch a few late blooms this season, especially with reblooming varieties like Stella d'Oro, which is famous for flowering from early summer well into fall. Even if flowers hold off entirely until next year, the plant spends this season building a strong root system that powers a much better show the following summer. So think of it as a guaranteed return on a fairly modest investment of effort now. Daylilies want at least 6 hours of sun and deep, consistent watering while establishing, roughly the first 3 to 4 weeks. After that, they're largely self-sufficient and among the most low-maintenance flowering perennials you can grow. Amending the planting hole with compost gives them a strong start, especially in poorer or compacted soil. Dividing the clumps every 3 to 4 years keeps them vigorous and blooming well, and it also gives you free plants to fill in other parts of the garden or share. With thousands of registered cultivars available in nearly every color except true blue and pure white, daylilies are also one of the easiest ways to build a long, colorful border without much design expertise. Just group a few different bloom times together, and you'll have color from June through September. Daylilies are also remarkably good at outcompeting weeds once established. Their dense, arching foliage shades out the soil around them, which makes them an excellent low-maintenance choice for slopes, banks, or any spot in the yard you'd rather not spend a lot of time weeding. They handle everything from full sun to fairly significant shade, though bloom count drops the less light they get, and they tolerate both clay and sandy soils better than most flowering perennials, which is part of why they show up so often along roadsides and in older, neglected gardens that still put on a show every summer. If you're buying in July, look specifically for reblooming or extended bloom varieties rather than once-blooming heirloom types, since these are far more likely to reward you with flowers this same season instead of asking you to wait entirely until next year. One small caution: daylilies are toxic to cats, so if you have an indoor-outdoor cat that likes to nibble on greenery, it's worth keeping them out of reach. Daylilies have also developed something of a cult following among hobbyist hybridizers, with dedicated clubs and regional shows built entirely around new cultivars each year. So if you end up enjoying this plant more than you expected, it's a genuinely deep rabbit hole to fall into. Some collectors maintain hundreds of named varieties in a single garden. For a first planting, though, you really don't need to overthink it. A handful of reliable, widely available cultivars in staggered bloom times will give you a full season of color without any of the collecting culture attached to it. Plant 8. Lavender. Lavandula species are Mediterranean natives that evolved in intense summer heat, thin rocky soil, and long dry spells, so July in most of North America feels genuinely mild by comparison. Lavender doesn't just tolerate summer heat, it thrives in it, and English lavender varieties are hardy in zones 5 through 9, with some hardier cultivars pushing into zone 4. Those familiar spikes of soft purple carry a fragrance that's impossible to forget, and pollinators, bees especially, find a newly planted patch within days. For July planting, drainage is the single most important factor. Lavender will not survive soggy soil. Root rot is essentially the only way this plant dies, so use a raised bed, a slope, or an elevated spot if your ground tends to hold water. Aim for alkaline to neutral soil, roughly pH 6.7 to 7.3, working in a little garden lime if your soil runs acidic, which is common in areas with high rainfall. Munstead and Hidcote are two of the most reliable English lavender varieties for home gardens, both compact and cold-ha. RDY. If you're in a hotter, more humid climate, Spanish lavender or the hardier phenomenal cultivar tend to perform better, since some lavenders struggle with humidity as much as they struggle with wet soil. It keeps blooming through August and sometimes into September, and like yarrow, it dries beautifully. Cut bundles, tie them with twine, and hang them for months of use in sachets, arrangements, or simply for the scent. Plant in full sun, water it in well at planting, and then largely leave it alone. Lavender wants sun and drainage, not fussing, and overwatering an established plant is far more dangerous than underwatering one. Lavender is also one of the more deer and rabbit-resistant plants you can grow, thanks to its strong scent, which makes it a smart border plant to place along the edges of a bed to help protect more vulnerable neighbors as well. A light shearing right after the main bloom flush, taking off about a third of the plant, keeps it compact and encourages a tidier shape going into fall, while avoiding cutting back hard into old woody growth, which lavender often won't recover from. If you're growing it specifically for cooking or crafts, harvest the flower spikes just as the lowest buds on the stem start to open. That's when the essential oil content is highest, and hang them to dry the same way you would yarrow. In cooler zones, a light winter mulch of gravel rather than organic mulch around the base helps prevent the crown from staying damp through freeze-thaw cycles, which is a more common cause of winter loss than the cold itself. Plant 9. Sedum. If you want a plant that genuinely cannot be talked out of thriving in July, Sedum is it. This wide-ranging genus includes everything from low ground cover types to upright border varieties like the well-known Autumn Joy. And almost all of them are drought-tolerant and low-maintenance by nature, hardy across a broad range from zones 3 through 9, depending on the species. Their fleshy, succulent leaves store water internally, which is exactly why they shrug off the kind of dry spells that stress out thirstier perennials on this list. Upright sedums produce broad, flat flower clusters that start out a soft green-pink in late summer and deepen into a rusty bronze by fall, giving you color and structure well past the point when most perennials have finished for the year. Pollinators, especially bees and late-season butterflies, treat these flower heads like a buffet, and it's genuinely one of the best late-season nectar sources you can plant. Plant sedum in full sun and well-drained soil. Like lavender and yarrow, it does not want to sit in moisture, and gritty or sandy soil suits it better than rich, heavily amended beds. Water it in at planting and through the first couple of weeks while roots establish, then largely step back. Sedum needs very little from you after that and can go long stretches without rain without showing any stress. It pairs beautifully with yarrow and Russian sage for a textural, drought-wise planting, and the seed heads look striking left standing through winter, catching frost and adding structure to an otherwise bare garden. Low, spreading sedums also work well tucked between stepping stones or cascading over the edge of a raised bed, so this is a genuinely versatile plant beyond just the classic upright border form. One thing that trips people up with sedum is a phenomenon called flopping, where a mature clump splits open in the middle and the stems fall outward. This usually happens in soil that's too rich or in a spot with a bit less sun than sedum wants, and the fix is either giving it a hard cutback by about half in early June to encourage bushier, sturdier growth, or dividing the clump if it's gotten too large for its space. Sedum is also exceptionally easy to propagate. A single stem cutting stuck directly into soil will often root on its own within a couple of weeks, which makes it one of the cheapest ways to fill out a new bed, since one nursery plant can become several within a season. It's a strong choice for green roofs, gravel gardens, and rock gardens, specifically because of how little soil depth and moisture it actually needs to survive. And unlike a lot of the plants on this list, deer and rabbits tend to leave the thick, waxy foliage alone entirely. Plant 10, blanket flower. Gaillardia earns its common name honestly. Its daisy-like blooms in warm red, orange, and yellow look like they were designed to cover a garden bed in a blanket of color. And they do it right through the hottest stretch of summer. Native to North and South America and hardy in zones 3 through 9, blanket flower is genuinely drought-resistant and holds up well even in poor, sandy soil, which makes it a forgiving choice if you're still working on improving your beds. Planted in full sun, it needs the heat and light to perform well, and it tends to sulk or get leggy in too much shade. Deadheading spent blooms extends the flowering concy, darably giving you color from midsummer well into fall, though even a neglected patch keeps producing surprisingly well on its own, which makes this one of the lowest effort plants on the entire list. Water it deeply while it establishes over the first few weeks, then ease off considerably. Overwatering is a bigger risk to blanket flower than underwatering ever is, and rich, consistently moist soil actually shortens its lifespan rather than helping it. It's a short-lived perennial for some gardeners, often lasting only 2 to 3 years, but it self-seeds generously, so a July planting has a way of turning into a permanent, ever-renewing patch of color within a couple of seasons without any real effort on your part. Blanket flower is also an excellent cut flower and a strong butterfly attractor, and it pairs naturally with yarrow, salvia, and black-eyed Susan for a hot-colored, drought-tolerant summer border that basically takes care of itself once established. Together with the other 9 plants on this list, it rounds out a planting palette that covers nearly every bloom time from midsummer straight through the first frost. Blanket flower is also remarkably tolerant of poor, sandy, or even salty soil, which makes it one of the better choices for gardeners near the coast or anywhere road salt is an issue in winter. It's a favorite for gravel gardens and xeriscaping for the same reason sedum and yarrow work well in those settings. All 3 ask for almost nothing once established. If your plants start to look a little tired or sparse by their 2nd or 3rd year, that's normal for this shorter-lived perennial, and rather than replacing them, Just let a few seed heads mature and drop before you deadhead the rest. The resulting seedlings will keep the patch going indefinitely with essentially no cost or extra planting on your part. A few practices apply across all 10 of these plants and are worth keeping in mind as you plant this month. Water in the late afternoon or evening rather than the middle of the day, so transplants get a gentler introduction than midday heat would give them. Water deeply and less frequently rather than a light daily sprinkle, since deep watering encourages roots to grow downward into cooler, more stable soil instead of staying shallow and heat-stressed near the surface. A 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch around each plant, kept an inch or so away from the stems, holds moisture, moderates soil temperature, and cuts down significantly on how often you'll need to water through the rest of summer. Hold off on heavy fertilizing for the first few weeks after planting. Wait until you see new growth emerging. That's your sign the roots have taken hold, and the plant is ready to put energy into top growth. And if a transplant droops a little in its first few days, that's normal transplant stress rather than a sign of failure. Keep up with consistent watering, and most of these 10 will bounce back within a week and settle in for the long haul. I said at the start that you haven't missed your window, and I meant every word. Coneflower, black-eyed Susan, Yarrow, Shasta Daisy, Balm, Salvia, Daylily, Lavender, Sedum, and blanket flower are proof that a July planting can still give you real color this season and a stronger, more resilient garden for years to come. Water deeply, mulch well, plant in the cooler hours of the day, and give these 10 a chance. If this helped, hit like, and if you know someone staring at an empty bed wondering if it's too late, send this their way. It isn't. I'm John Sam. I'll see you in the next one.